Good morning, everybody. Happy Thursday. We have an amazing show for everybody today. What do we have, Krystal?
Indeed we do. First and foremost, Saagar is back. Nice to have you back,
it's
my friend.
very nice to be back on this side of the Atlantic. I'm very happy to be.
Congratulations are in order as well.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Yes, we had fun. Ate Indian food the entire time I was in London. No bangers and mash for me.
Does Jillian like Indian food as much as you do?
No, but when we're in London, it's one of those things where we just kind of have to go with it. So,
okay,
yeah.
fair enough.
We did the whole high tea thing, all right? So, she got her fill.
All right, good deal. All right, there's a lot to get into this morning. First of all, tomorrow is the 1-year anniversary of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So there's a lot of news there. Also, we want to just take a look back at, where we've been, where we are today. And especially we've got some maps, we've got some polling that can kind of assess how the American public feels about all of this, how the world feels about this, and just what has happened on the battlefield since the launch of that invasion a year ago. Also, potential Trump indictments coming down from that grand jury in Georgia, and the forewoman is something else. We will show you a little bit of that and tell you what we know. Also, Trump visited East Palestine yesterday. Democrats continue to be sort of completely absent. The NTSB report is expected to come out today, and we're getting new revelations about that water testing that was conducted apparently by the railroad. 2024 news, rumblings that Biden isn't actually going to run.
Mm-hmm.
I don't really take it seriously, but, it's important to report on it at the same time. Kind of, I have to say, as we predicted, Saagar, as Trump has been out there basically by himself running for president on the Republican side, his hand is strengthening. He is increasing in the polls. So, he's still the one to beat, ultimately. We also have Sean Hannity talking to Marjorie Taylor Greene about her big national divorce idea. I commented on this earlier this week with Emily, but interested to get Saagar's.
I won't say I was sad to miss this discourse. I will weigh in.
Well.
Yeah.
We had to make sure to bring it back for you so everybody can hear your thoughts as well. But let's go ahead and start with what is going on in Ukraine.
All right, so let's go ahead and put this up there on the screen. President Biden visiting Kyiv and giving a major speech, as well as another one in Warsaw after President Vladimir Putin delivered one in Russia, reiterating the unending commitment both to NATO, the eastern flank, and specifically to Ukraine and ongoing continued military support. Here's what he had to say.
He thought he'd get the Finlandization of NATO. Instead, he got the NATOization of Finland and Sweden. He thought NATO would fracture and divide. Instead, NATO is more united and more unified than ever. Our support for Ukraine will not waver. NATO will not be divided, and we will not tire.
So reiterating there that it's actually made NATO stronger. It actually has increased military spending. Of course, Finland and Sweden on the process of possibly being admitted. But since it's the 1 year, we got to take a step back almost from the current developments and just say what's happening and where will these things end? Obviously, we've been covering the war almost for the entire year. It was a big moment for breaking points. It's when many of our viewers and our listeners actually joined us. And it hasn't always been easy, been wrong a lot, and I think that's fine. But one of the interviews here by respected historian at Princeton, Stephen Kotkin, I actually think did a fantastic job of just summing everything up in an interview in the New Yorker with David Remnick. Let's put this up there on the screen. I'm going to read from this one particular passage in particular. He says, David Remnick kind of challenging Stephen Kotkin. Last year, you told me that Ukraine was winning on Twitter, but that Russia was winning on the battlefield. A lot has happened since then. Is that still the case? He says, quote, unfortunately, let's think of a house. Let's say you own a house and it has 10 rooms. Let's say I barge in and take 2 of those rooms away. I wreck those rooms. From those 2 rooms, I'm wrecking your other 8 rooms, and you're trying to beat me back. You're trying to evict me from the 2 rooms. You push out a corner. You push out another corner, maybe. But I'm still there. I'm still wrecking. The thing is, you need your house. That's where you live. It's your house. You don't have another house. Me, I have another house. My other house has 1,000 rooms. So if I wreck your house, are you winning or am I winning? Unfortunately, that's the situation that we're in. Ukraine has beaten back the Russian attempt to conquer their country. They have defended their capital. They've pushed the Russians out of some of their land that the Russians conquered since February 24th. They've regained about half of it. And yet they need their house, and the Russians are wrecking it. Putin's strategy could be described as, I can't have it, then nobody can have it. Sadly, that is where the tragedy is right now. And I thought that was a fantastic way of kind of summing it all up in terms of what absolute victory would look like on the Russian side. Is that a defeat? I mean, on relative terms, yes, in terms of international prestige. However, the ongoing attrition and the war against Ukraine is, of course, just making, is devastating the country, requiring hundreds of billions of dollars, untold amounts of ammunition. While I was in the UK, I couldn't help but listen to some of the news. I mean, and in terms of what the revelations are about the NATO chiefs that were meeting in Europe while I was gone, was the cry for ammo. The amount of ammo that Ukraine is using right now on the battlefield is just unbelievable. And that's actually before the Russian offensive has even kicked off. There are some rumblings today. We may have to do a breaking news segment or something, because right, tomorrow is officially the one-year anniversary of the war. That's why, or the invasion. That's why we're covering it this way right now. Ukraine is saying that there are major signs of a Russian offensive exactly tomorrow on February 24th, which is only going to require even more bloodshed, ammunition, and expenditure on their part. And the reason why I thought that interview was important is there is an ongoing recognition here in Washington amongst the elites. They're like, this is going to be a long one, and total victory does not appear in sight for anybody. Let's put this up there from Fiona Hill. She was writing in Unheard. So the reason why this is important is Fiona Hill is possibly one of the most hawkish elements of the Trump administration on Russia, very pro-Ukraine and all of that, and still writing a column which, frankly takes some courage, at least by telling the truth in Washington, saying, quote, absolute victory over Russia just is not possible. The former Trump advisor on the West's mistakes in Ukraine. She says, specifically within all of this interview, that given her advice in the Bush administration and what happened with George W. Bush, she says that there is no possibility of a quote absolute victory over Russia, of the idea that the Putin regime was going to fall, of some sort of grand some sort of grand idea that the Ukrainians are not only going to push Russia back through the February 24 borders, but take back all of Crimea.
Yeah.
If you combine, Krystal, I think the Kotkin view, the Fiona Hill view, that Washington Post article that we covered before I left, where there was basically a note from the Biden people who were like, look, this is it. The blank check pretty much is dried up in Congress with Republicans. America's moving on, and after this, however you guys do in the offensive, you're going to have to try and figure out some sort of solution, because, your endless supply of ammunition and all that, it's just not sustainable. And we already covered so many stories here about how the war in Ukraine has massively depleted American stockpiles of ammunition, our own defense readiness, and in the context of any other conflict. We're probably weaker right now than we have been in a long time in terms of our defense readiness. Not that many of the hawks who care about that in Washington will ever tell you. So it's a crazy situation to look at it geopolitically and just like what the actual state is in terms of where things can move from here.
Yeah, there is a growing sort of elite awareness that absolute victory over Russia was a fantasy. And Kotkin talks about the fact that everybody was hoping for these sort of shortcut solutions to the war, like, oh, maybe there'll be a domestic revolt in Russia that will topple the Putin regime. Not happening. Ain't happening. So that one's off the table. There were all of these rumors and fantasies that maybe Putin's really ill and maybe he's like on his deathbed and he's about to die. No real sign that that is coming to pass either. So all of the shortcut hopes for ending this conflict have faded out of view. And so then what are you left with? Well, if you're not going to achieve a total victory over Russia, which again is not our assessment, it's the assessment now of the RAND Corporation. It's reportedly, according to the Washington Post, the assessment of U.S. intelligence agencies. It's apparently the assessment of Fiona Hill. It's an assessment of Stephen Kotkin, who's a liberal historian, by the way, of Russia and the Soviet Union. Well, then this is going to end at the negotiating table. That's where we're ultimately headed. It's a question of who's in what position when you get to that negotiating table and what ultimately the terms are going to be. Because the other thing Kotkin points out is right now you're in a war of attrition. And the way that you win a war of attrition is by, number one, disrupting your enemy's ability to produce, manufacture weapons. There was a thought that the sanctions that we levied on Russia, which were quite overwhelming and in concert with a lot of our allies, that would effectively disrupt their manufacturing capability. That has come to naught. And at the same time, so one way is to disrupt their production. That's one thing you want to do. The other piece you want to do is ramp up your own production. Well, we're not doing that. What we're doing is drawing down our stockpiles. And we're getting to a place where we're going to be limited in our ability to do that. So, okay, you're not going to win the war of attrition either. And I thought the way Kotkin talked about how do you think about victory? Because part of this is, all right, well, what do you actually define as a win for Ukraine? And let me read to you what he ultimately says, because his conclusion is, I'm in favor of a Ukrainian victory. This isn't some like, go Russia, Putin's actually right dude. He's in favor of Ukrainian victory. I'm against the Russian victory, but I'm defining a Ukrainian victory within the circumstances in which we live. Now, he says, Their definition of victory, as expressed by President Zelensky, who has certainly more than risen to the occasion, is to regain every inch of territory, to have reparations, to have war crimes tribunals. So how would Ukraine enact that definition of victory? They would have to take Moscow. Do you all think that that's likely? Do you think that would be good? How else can you get reparations and war crime tribunals? They're not that close to regaining every inch of their own territory, let alone those other aims. Here's a better definition of victory. Ukrainians rose up against their domestic tyrants. Why? Because they wanted to join Europe. It's the same goal they have now, and that has to be the definition of victory. Ukraine gets into the European Union. If Ukraine regains all of its territory and doesn't get into the EU, is that a victory? As opposed to if Ukraine regains as much of its territory as it physically can on the battlefield, not all of it, potentially, but does get EU accession, would that be a definition of victory? Of course it would be. And then he goes on to talk about those dynamics I was just mentioning before with the war of attrition and how it is impossible that they're going to achieve this total victory that they have imagined and that the Biden administration has allowed to persist as some sort of logical endpoint to this when in reality it's an impossible fantasy.
Yeah, so let's put the maps, and I think this actually really hammers home Stephen Kotkin's point. These are 4 maps. So right there you can see on February 23rd, exactly 2022, a year ago, where the occupied region were the Russian-backed separatists, and then you had Crimea. So then we have March 30th, 2022. We have occupation in the north, all basically along the Russian-Belarusian border, up from Crimea into eastern Ukraine. So significant gains. Then you have the August 31st lines, where you had the Russian-controlled areas. That's the third map for those who are watching. And then finally, you kind of have the November 30th, 2022 map, which shows some of the massive gains that were made by the Ukrainians in their offensive and have put things to where we are right now with the currently fluctuating front line. But the point that I think we should really look at is when we look at retaken territory, that's fantastic. You still see a hell of a lot of red on that map, Krystal. And that's exactly what he's pointing to, is that with all the red in that map, for all of the $100 billion or now that we've appropriated to Ukraine, I think we've dispensed about half of that. We have indications from the Biden administration that Ukraine, by the end of the summer, is going to expend all of the aid that the U.S. military has given them. It would require even more acts of Congress to appropriate that. That doesn't look very likely through a Republican coalition. And one of the things we're about to talk about, too, is, look, we have been the staunchest, most hawkish allies, and we are bankrolling this war 10 times more than any other nation in all of Europe, simply because of capacity and because we basically underwrite the Europeans. Well, we already know they're not going to step up. They have crippling inflation, and they don't have the capacity even if they wanted to. I mean, you look at the UK and, for all the tanks and all of that, most of what Ukraine is using on the battlefield are bullets and artillery and missiles. And for all the intelligence and all that requires a tremendous amount of raw industrial production. We also have major meeting that's happening today. President Putin meeting with China's top diplomat Wang Yi. And in that, we are seeing rumblings from the U.S. intelligence community that they are quickly going to declassify indications that the Chinese are considering sending lethal aid to Russia, something they have not thought about before. Let's think about it from their perspective. This is the greatest thing that China could ever wish for. Why? Because the more that this conflict goes on, the more American weapons that pour into Ukraine. And from the NATO alliance, this is taking a tremendous amount of expenditure. Furthermore, the economic cost of the war has got to be in the trillions of dollars whenever you consider the energy impact, the disruption to the global supply chain, wheat. I mean, who even knows? One day, the eventual accounting will be made 100 years from now when you can write about it dispassionately, and you are never going to, you will barely be able to believe, what the chicanery that's probably gone from the global financial system. Obviously, we survived here in the West, but there's a lot of poverty actually that was written across the world. So when you consider all that, China's got no incentive. But initially it was like, oh, China's got egg on its face, all of that. Just yesterday, what did they do? They put out a statement and they were like, yeah, it's the U.S.'s fault that this is entire happening. This is U.S. hegemony. Wang Yi's visit to Moscow is no accident, especially after all this balloon stuff and more of the frosty relations. And it wouldn't be a surprise or a shock at all for them to continue to start shipping lethal weapons to Russia. Yeah. And if that happens, I mean, then look, what have we done? This is the nightmare that Nixon and Kissinger went out of their way to stop, which is a total alliance between communist China and then the Soviet Union. We always recognize that having split between the two is to the strategic benefit of the United States. So anyway, I think that's a grand picture of where things are. It's very possible there can be some breaking news tomorrow on the one-year anniversary. But going forward, it just looks like things are relatively stuck and brutal fighting ahead in the months to come. And the summer, very likely to be a major decision point for the West, for Ukraine, and for Russia.
Hey guys, ready or not, 2024 is fully upon us now, and Saagar and I have been brainstorming ways that we can really up our game for this critical election.
Yeah, we rely on our premium subs to expand our coverage, to add staff, to upgrade the studio. We just want to give you the best independent coverage of this election, which is possible. So if you can help us out, become a premium subscriber today, breakingpoints.com, or the link is down here in the description video. It really means the world to us, and if you like what we're all about, this is the best possible way to keep us 100% independent, working only for you.